Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get started. We have some really important items on our agenda this afternoon for this committee, Government Operations and Fiscal Policy. Two are related, and then another one that will be a discussion on some possible amendments to the Public Election Fund. And so let's get right into this conversation. We'll start first with a Office of Legislative Oversight report. This is 2019-15, measuring MC311 system performance. And of course, this will be a discussion on what has been done up until now, and we'll hear some possible recommendations as well. I do want to thank both council staff and OLO for the hard work in preparing both packets for today, particularly Ms. Victoria Hall from Office of Legislative Oversight, Ms. Amanda Myhill, and Dr. Costas Torregas from council staff. We really do appreciate all the work that you do in helping us strategically figure out where we need to go next. I also want to acknowledge publicly that, we've had a lot of conversations about 311 in this committee. I remember when it was first launched, and we had a lot of really important conversations about soft launch and how to track how things were going, including this committee's leadership in providing additional resources during our operating budget to enhance the staff available to respond to the very complex issues that our constituents face every day. And so I want to make sure that I acknowledge all the hard work that has gone into ensuring that this service is one that everybody can trust, can rely on, and of course we are investing quite a bit, and it is in concept a really important tool and a resource for our constituents. At the same time, we have to acknowledge there continues to be a lot of challenges and a lot of issues, and as a district council member, of course, we tend to see those firsthand. All three of us are district council members, so we deal with that on a daily basis. And what we're trying to do now that there is a new administration is understand where it's going, what it's going to be, sort of the both investment enhancements with regards to this very important system, and this is why it is really critical that we continue this conversation and understand how we're going to be approaching this next fiscal year in terms of budget, what may be included in order to strengthen all of this. I do want to welcome Mr. Roberts in his new role in leading 311, somebody that we know very well. So I want to welcome you, as well as Mr. Hudson. It's a very important, as I reiterate again, important investment for us. But let's get started then with, in terms of the first item specifically, is the OLO report 2019-15. Let me turn it over, and you can tell us about the highlights of the report, and we'll engage in a conversation.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Tori Hall from the Office of Legislative Oversight. I'm here to brief you on OLO report entitled Measuring 311 System Performance. Today's report responds to the Council's request as part of OLO's fiscal year 19 work program that OLO review the metrics the county currently uses to measure 311 performance and to explore other potential variables. To research and prepare this report, OLO interviewed county staff from MC311, County Stat, OHR, OMB, and the Department of Technology Services. OLO analyzed MC311 data and documents and reviewed call center industry research more broadly. OLO also interviewed 311 call center officials from other jurisdictions and attended the Engage 311 North American Conference in Phoenix this past April. OLO received a high level of cooperation from everyone involved in this study and sincerely appreciates the information and insights shared by all who participated. So this report, this report follows up and builds on two fairly recent prior OLO reports on MC311, which are listed here, and this reflects the Council's ongoing interest in community interactions with MC311. In the interest of time today, I'm going to walk you through OLO's findings and recommendations, but to briefly give you a sense here, the report has a lot of information in it, and the evolution of 311, about the 311 organization, staffing and governance, about its budget, and about outcome data related to incoming calls, and web portal usage and service requests by type and source. And I'm happy to answer any questions about all of that, but I'm going to, in the interest of time today, just walk you through OLO's findings and recommendations. And so moving on to item number 3 here, going over the OLO findings. First of all, finding number 1 is that in many larger jurisdictions, 311 has evolved rapidly from just a phone number, as it started in Baltimore in 1996, to divert calls from 911 to a much more complex system that covers many services and types of information, and also uses multiple channels of communication. So when when MC311 system was first established, from the start, it consisted of a web portal and a call center. So to briefly give some background on the scale of what the MC311 system does, this slide shows the total number of service requests. And there have consistently been over 500,000 service requests a year. Most service requests come through the call center, which is the orange bar shown here for each year, although the portion coming from the self-help web portal, which is shown in green, has risen over the years. I would note that the top dashed line here shows the total number of service requests, and the bottom dotted line shows the abandoned calls to 311. So although the overall number of service requests has declined a bit recently, the number of abandoned calls increased, and it's likely that some abandoned calls would have been additional service requests. OLO's second finding is that the county set 3 original goals for MC311: to streamline access for residents, to save costs by consolidating call centers and IT systems, and to collect data that will hold the county government more accountable, and to track trends. From a customer perspective, these 3 goals often work in tandem, but sometimes they seem to conflict with each other, such as when a resident knows the county office they want to reach, but must still use MC311 to contact it, particularly if they're unaware about how using MC311 might serve the 3rd goal of increasing government accountability for service delivery. The council asked OLO to review the performance measures for MC311, and this slide shows the 7 measures that are currently published each year by county stat and OMB. Number 1, average speed to answer, and number 6, abandoned call rate, are highlighted here because they declined in performance from fiscal year 16 to 19. OLO found that these are good indicators of performance, but alone don't tell the full story. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment, but first, number 2 is customer satisfaction. OLO found that this measure is of limited use because MC311 only surveys its customers who give them an email address, and they represent just 7% of all customers. The responses reported here are real, but OLO found they're unlikely to be representative of all customers. Number 3 is cost per customer contact. OLO found that this measure is of limited use because it counts some call center costs but not web portal costs, and then divides it by all contacts from the call center and the web portal. OLO recommends revising this formula to either include web portal costs or to focus on the call center contacts. Number 5 is the rate of first call resolution. OLO found that this measure doesn't reflect cases where a customer might have had to call more than once to get their question answered or a service completed. The current ratio does show the portion of requests handled solely by the call center, and that's interesting information. So for that reason, OLO recommends renaming the current measure and then developing another measure for first call resolution that will better assess how often people may be contacting MC311 more than once to resolve a single question or service request. Now I'd like to turn to average speed to answer and abandoned call rate, which are the performance measures that declined in recent years, and these are the focus of OLO finding number 4. Speed to answer refers to the number of seconds that elapse after a caller listens to the automated greeting and then waits in the queue to reach a customer service rep. Abandoned calls refer to those where the caller hangs up while waiting in the call queue. You can think of the abandoned call rate results as an indicator of the caller's willingness to wait on hold, their tolerance to wait on hold. So as these graphs show, OLO found a relationship between these two measures and the number of call center reps available to answer calls. As we'd expect, the more customer service reps were available, the faster the average speed to answer and the fewer callers who hung up while waiting. So since average speed to answer and abandoned call rate outcomes are largely driven by the number of people answering the phones, it leads to a central question of how many customer service reps are needed. Chapter 4 of this report goes into some detail about how call centers estimate this, but essentially industry best practice is to use the Erlang-C formula or a workforce optimization tool based on those principles to estimate this. And this requires a series of assumptions about the variables that are listed here. First of all, incoming call volumes, which include the historic patterns of busy days. Crucially, because the calls tend to bunch up, call centers must plan for busy times rather than average call volumes to meet their service level targets. The second is the service level goal, which is an organizational policy choice. And there's the average call handle time. The more complex the calls the longer they tend to take, and the longer the handle time, the fewer calls an operator can take per hour. Occupancy rate is the percentage of time that available CSRs are actively occupied with calls. And the question here is, what is a sustainable expectation for the customer service reps? And then there's shrinkage, which is the percentage of time that paid operators are unavailable to take calls because of training and other types of leave, such as vacation, sick leave, and FMLA. So, for example, if you were to assume call volumes and patterns based on MC311's 10 busiest days in the first 6 months of 2019, a service level goal of 80-20, which means that 80% of calls are answered within 20 seconds, an occupancy rate of 85%, and a shrinkage rate of 30%, then at least 45 filled customer service rep positions would likely be needed to meet the service level goal. And this detailed kind of analysis may be helpful to council members during budget discussions about proposed staffing levels for the call center. For fiscal year 19, 40 customer service rep positions were budgeted but there was a gap between the budgeted number and the customer service reps available to take calls in any given month. There will always be a gap between the number of positions in the budget and the number of customer service reps available to take calls. OLO found that the gap at the call center had several specific components. So to walk you through the graph here, the dotted line along the top shows the budgeted number of CSRs. The solid black bar at the bottom shows the number of filled CSR positions where the employees were available to answer phones. The black and white checked area shows shrinkage, which is the filled CSR positions where those employees weren't available to take calls because of training and leave and the like. The diagonally striped red area shows vacant customer service rep positions for which OHR and MC311 were actively recruiting in that month. The solid red area represents vacant customer service rep positions subject to the county's hiring freeze. So no matter how a position is vacant, whether from a retirement, a promotion, or because it was newly created, before OHR could recruit to fill them, the department was required to apply to OMB to grant a waiver from the hiring freeze. So for example, in October 2018, 6 vacant CSR positions were frozen and OHR and MC311 could not recruit to fill them. And finally, the white area at the top represents positions that existed in the budget but which OMB hadn't yet created in the system. So in a sense, they weren't even really vacancies because they didn't yet exist in the OHR system. So the combined effect of these factors meant that the call center had consistently fewer call center representatives available to take calls than the budgeted number might suggest, and which in something like an Erlang-C calculation might suggest are needed to meet the current targets. Most departments were subject to the hiring freeze, but since the call center has a higher turnover rate than the average for county employees, which is typical for this occupation nationwide. It was affected by the freeze more than the average county office. And I want to add that while the call center had in past years used temporary employees to fill staffing gaps, starting in 2017, OHR determined that the call center could no longer use temps, and that reduced its flexibility to staff up for busy call times or to cover turnover and shrinkage. OLO's fifth and final finding is that how the MC311 system performs can be considered in two broad areas: its availability and its accuracy. But up to this point, performance measures have not focused on accuracy. Chapter 4 of the report goes into some detail about this, but broadly speaking, OLO has suggested putting more focus on assessing, for example, whether the residents find the web portal easy to navigate, whether they're finding answers to their questions online or must switch from the portal to the call center to get what they need, and whether servicing departments are maximizing the services they make requestable online. And with regard to accuracy, OLO suggests strengthening tools that assess whether the knowledge base articles, which are used by the CSRs at the call center to answer questions and which residents can read for themselves on the web portal, are up to date, and are they clear? OLO suggests giving users a chance to offer instant feedback if they find that a knowledge base article needs revision or clarification. The MC311 system uses GIS information from Department of Technology Services to answer questions and create service requests, but is the GIS information accurate? And when a servicing department says they've completed a service request, is it true? In this report, OLO has offered some specific suggestions that could work toward that. So to summarize, the OLO recommendations, they really fall into three categories. First, revising the performance measures currently used and augmenting these with staffing indicators to give more context to them. Second is maximizing the use of the self-help web portal. And third, placing more focus on assessing accuracy through several of the specific options that OLO has detailed in the report. So to conclude, the OLO report offers some questions for further discussion, and they fall generally under the following category. MC311 is meant to serve as a streamlined gateway, but whether residents perceive it as a gateway or as a gatekeeper in reaching county offices is a matter of judgment. In cases where a resident already knows the county office they want to call, but they must use 311 to reach it, MC311 can feel like a gatekeeper, especially if the resident doesn't know how the system holds servicing departments more accountable. How's the county struck the right balance here and how it uses 311? In cases where a caller has a more complex question, to what extent should the customer service reps try to use the knowledge base articles to answer the question versus serving as more of a switchboard to connect callers with employees at the servicing departments? And are the three original goals, first established almost 10 years ago, still relevant? And if so, how are we ensuring that they're being met? These questions about the role and function of 311 may warrant further discussion. And this concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Hall. This is a really great report, as always. Really good work from the Office of Legislative Oversight. I think what I'd like to do is have Mr. Robertson Hudson, if you can just go ahead and come up to the table. And we do have a second item that is so closely related to this one. So I think I just want to go ahead and blend those two items as we engage in the conversation. Why don't we, so you have a presentation?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
Okay, let's go ahead and do that, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Torregas, and you can talk about some of your observations, and then we'll engage in discussion, and then wrap it up. So go ahead, Mr. Thompson.
First of all, Madam Chair and members of the committee, I'd like to thank you for having us here today. Our first opportunity as a team to come and present to you. I will say real quickly, because I know we're short for time, I also want to thank OLO for the report. As a person who's, I think next week marks 5 months, who was coming into this, this was, frankly, a nice from my experience, like having a consultant provide you with a management report before you come into the position. So I think we had a good working relationship in putting this together, so I appreciate the work that went into it. What we want to do is quickly, because I know time is not on our side in terms of being able to talk forever, which I can do. I wanted to walk you through kind of giving you where we are today based on some of those recommendations and just things that we've tried to do over the last 4 months or so that I've been the director. And I don't think I really need to go through this slide because this kind of gives you a timestamp of what happened 10 years ago. But just from a really quick where we are currently at 37 employees there, and we actually have 3 in the hiring process. I want to thank the council, particularly Madam Chair, for putting in extra money for us to get to the 40. We hope to beat that number by the end of next month. We have 3 people that we're looking at to fill us out. But I wanted to give the committee some idea of how a day looks for us. On an average day, the CSRs handle 67 calls and about 17,000 per year. We have 2 levels, a Tier 1 and a Tier 2. We have 12 Spanish-speaking CSRs, and over 2,000 requests are handled daily. And we handle, at least answered, close to 500,000 calls per year. On an average month, about 40,000 calls, and an average day, about 1,800 calls. And for our busiest months, October, August, and May. And our busiest times of day are between 9 and 3 p.m., and we have spikes in there around 10 or noon. If you can look at our request volume, and this kind of gives you an idea of how our web requests look. We wanted to kind of give you a snapshot of the growth there. We have been seeing, as OLO pointed out, a growth in that particular piece. And one of the things that we've been trying to do, at least in the last 4 months or so, is trying to really have a much more candid conversation internally about making the website more customer-friendly and more service-friendly. We actually do want people to use that from a convenience perspective, so that number going up is good for us, and we hope to see that number continue to increase. Just to give you an idea of the top types of requests that we get, and I'm sure many of you know this because they're the calls that may come to your office. But we just wanted to give you some general idea, if you hadn't seen it all in one place, where our top calls are coming from. OLO mentioned, and Tori mentioned specifically, the whole issue of knowledge-based articles. They really are our intelligence. That's how the representative is able to adjust or handle a call. And we have about 3,600 of those. The content is provided by departments, and it's maintained by departments in conjunction with our 311 business analysts. Just wanted to give you an idea of what's been happening since the beginning of the fiscal year, and we have seen some improvement in our ability to handle the call volume. As you can see, we are now at a point where our average speed of answer, as well as our abandonment rate, has dropped. You can see at this time last year we were at 10%. We're down to 7% now. Our average speed of answer has dropped as well. And interestingly enough, our call volume is a little bit, our calls answered is up as well. The big thing to look at, and I think this is really central to the OLO report, that you can see that it really is leading to this increase, is that we have staff. Our staff has basically gone up 3 people. From this time last year, and obviously when you have more people, you're going to have less abandoned calls, you'll have a faster speed of answer. Did I go back? Yeah, there we go. The issues that we've been addressing from a short-run perspective, and the number one is staff, the ability to have enough staff to meet demand. In the scenario that Tori presented to us, she used the number of 45 based on the amount of calls that are coming in and all the other factors that we had in terms of measurement. And that number is a number we're still looking at. We're not totally sure it's 45, but we certainly know one thing, and since we're in the day after another great Nats victory, I'll use them as an example. We're going to the ballpark some days, and certainly last year, going on the field with 8 players instead of 9. That was essentially what was happening. So you can't cover all the bases, you can't cover all the field with 8 players. What we've been able to do over the last 3 or 4 months is focus on staffing so that we have more people out there to field the balls. And as a result of that, things have been going down. What we're looking at now is what is that correct number, and how do we achieve that? Will it be part-timers? Could it be some form of temporary staff? But we are looking at flexibility in order to meet those high points of the day, as well as, more importantly, kind of reaching the numbers that we need to have in terms of abandonment rate and average speed of answer. The other thing is trying to keep our knowledge-based articles current. That is absolutely a challenge, but it's very important. In Brian's role, and since I've been on board, we've tried very much to work directly with departments. Just 2 weeks ago, we brought our key department directors over to 311, explained to them the KBA process, how important it was to our operation, and essentially we said, we're your front door. We're the way that most residents find out about the services that you provide. So in order for us to be as effective as possible, these KBAs are essential to us being successful. We also talked to them as well about getting updates, not just about KBAs, but events that are going on in apartments that may happen from a marketing perspective, flyers, events that they may be having, because those calls come into the call center. And one thing that was mentioned as well is about the complexity of our call types. We've been looking really deeply at that, certainly. What is causing our calls to be more complex? Should those calls, should we be handling them as deeply as we are? Because they do take time. They take a considerable amount of time. And some of them require a great deal of expertise that our representatives have. However, is that the best use of our time in terms of being able to address the needs of the residents? So it plays very much into the recommendation of OLO. If you look at the next page, and it's really, we just wanted to kind of quickly show from a complexity perspective what kind of is driving the amount of time people are on the phone. And you can see the most complicated kinds of calls that we handle are from HHS, which are 6-minute calls, and if you count everything, it's an 8-minute call. And also OHR. For those who don't know, we actually handle a percentage of calls for OHR, particularly for retirees, and those calls take some time as well. So as we looked at these numbers, one of the things that we have been looking at is process. And process not just how we handle the call, but at what point do we hand off to the agency. There was a question that when I came on board that I was very interested in, and we looked at it very closely, and these numbers kind of represent it, is abandonment rate. What we wanted to really know is, what is a person's propensity to abandon? What's their tolerance? How long will they hold before they hang up the phone? Because those who have been in the call center industry a while know that an abandonment is not just an abandonment. Sometimes there are reasons why people hang up. So we want to look at time as well. So what you see here really quickly is a representation of some information that we kind of gathered, which essentially shows you what are the points when people are hanging up, and you can see our mean is about 2 minutes and 54 seconds. Our median is 2 minutes, and our mode, which is where most of the abandonments take place, is about a minute. Why is this information important? It helps us better understand our average speed of answer, and it also helps us better understand abandonment rates. As we look at our measurements, this kind of plays into us looking at that in terms of how long people can tolerate holding. But we're not looking to make people hold, but what we want to do is understand how long they are holding and how we need to adjust our service to deal with that. So as we look at solutions that we begin to implement over the last couple of months, some of the things that I wanted to kind of highlight is that we have started to look at research, start to better understand what's happening with our customers. And we just launched a focus group project. We've had 2 focus groups, actually one on Tuesday. We did one in East County last week, and one in Germantown on Tuesday night. About 10 people in each of those. And we talked about a myriad of issues regarding service. How are we doing? What do we need to adjust? Our focus now is we're trying to understand customer needs, and we're trying to understand customer expectations so we can build the systems and build the requirements that we need to service them as best as we possibly can. We also made some adjustments to the survey timing and frequency that OLO mentioned in their report. We've been doing a twice-a-year survey. We've decided to make those quarterly, and those are coming in at a high rate. They've been coming in at about 13%. In the last 2 ones we've sent out, I think we have a total of a couple of thousand responses to those that we're using as information to make adjustments. We also have started something that's really important to me, at least from my previous life as a call center manager, and that's quality assurance. And I define that as the ability to make sure that every person who calls gets the same service. And so what we've done, working with County Stat, is set up new measurements so that we can ramp up our quality assurance practices. That means listening to more calls. That means calibrating our calls from the people who are doing the quality assurance process to make sure everyone's listening for the same thing and our representatives are doing the same thing. Those QA standards will also go into performance measures of the staff so that the staff knows exactly what they're supposed to do and what benchmarks they're supposed to hit in that respect. And the key is to increase the frequency of it. We are doing it, but we're not doing it to the regimen and to the amount that we should be. In terms of processes, in terms of processes, we're actually identifying call types and handling subject matter experts in the department. And we're looking at things like, is this a call that should go back to the department? And Brian can, through questions or after we go through this, kind of explain or give some examples of how we're dealing with that. I talked already about filling vacancies faster, working with OHR to ensure that that happens. And we're trying to really be more creative about staffing because it's a different kind of business, and it's important for us for 2 reasons. OLO brought up the issue of occupancy, and right now I believe our occupancy, you saw the number of 85%, and that 85% basically means how much time are they on the phone and doing their job, and the other 15% is they get a couple of breaks and they go to lunch. So that 15% is, that other 15% is their 2 15-minute breaks and their 30-minute lunch. So if they go over that, obviously, that cuts into one of those things. So we're really focused on ensuring that occupancy is not too high, because that leads to dissatisfaction of job, that leads to dissatisfaction on the phone, but also it makes it harder for us to do retraining. So the other part about staffing that's important is that it allows us to keep our representatives constantly up to date on the things that are changing or adjusting in the agencies, so that they're better service representatives for the folks that call in. From a technology perspective, we're making adjustments there. We're starting to take a look, and the county executive as well as the CAO is actually, very pressing us on this side of it, particularly in the area of apps, particularly in the area of texting, and the ability also to upload photos. Some of those things that we really think would help improve the service experience, but also make us a little more effective in the long run. And the publishing, one of the things that I think we're working on right now is a really good recommendation from OLO, which is having a last date stamp on the KBAs. One of the things that you don't know is how recent that thing was, and having the ability of being able to date stamp that so we know it's time from a inventory or review process when it was last updated. That's one of the things that we're going to be adding. And just real quick from a technology standpoint, because we know that technology is a really big driver of the work we do, this is just a simple chart that kind of shows from a current state, we're really not in a bad place. But as we vision to the future, there are some things that we're going to need to consider. And obviously this committee would play a significant role in that decision-making process and how we would get there. As I've said, this is not a small decision. It's a very huge capital investment. And the way that we go forward, as we just discussed in a meeting the other day, is to let the business requirements drive us, and the needs of the county and the wishes of the county in terms of how it wants to service its residents guide us through that way. But our job is to bring the business requirements based on what we hear from customers and what we hear from our internal service groups. One of the other things that I want to add, and I've already talked about KBA improvements, and I talked about the departments coming over. One thing that Brian and I have talked about, and something I had instituted in my previous call center life, is to have liaisons. We understand that you all get calls, and we know that's going to happen in the work that you do. Residents and your constituents are going to call you. What we want to be able to do is to provide you with direct lines into an individual, one of the business analysts, that would work directly with you or whomever on your staff to resolve matters. The reason why this is important to us is it gives us better insight into process improvement, so we can go back to departments and figure out what the heck we need to do to make things work a little bit better. But in addition to that, it provides you and your staff the ability to hand something off and just follow up on it. The second thing I think it does, third thing I think it does, is allows us to get it into the CEPL system, so we have tracking and documentation of that particular concern. So that's something that we're going to walk through and figure out how we're going to implement that with you and your staffs, and certainly bring whomever from your teams over so we can talk about how we would institute that. The thing that we are going to be starting in the budget process is what we're calling budget collaboration. That means working with the departments, particularly the key ones that provide us the most calls in the more complicated situations we have, to work with them from a budget perspective on a number of things. Do we have enough staff to handle their particular work? What training or resources might we need? And are we doing something on our end that they have on their end that may be duplicated that we could either put in the call center or put back into the department? So those collaborations are going to take place during this coming process. But what we're also going to be instituting with that are going to be either semi-annually or quarterly reviews of the things that we agreed to do together to make sure that we're on the same page. In terms of technology, we're exploring some enhancements with DTS. I already talked about texting. automated email acknowledgement, which the OLO report talks about. We actually had that capability before, and we're going to look at ways of bringing that particular thing back. I already did talk about the date stamping of KBAs. This one is really important to me, and we've talked a lot about it over the last couple weeks, about transforming the website into a more customer-friendly site. And that means by departments. There are a lot of departments that provide service, there's information on the site, but the service side of the site, not just the part that I think OLO talked about, which is the area where you can do your service requests online, but the actual department site where people are coming to get service, trying to put that service piece up front. And the CAO as well as the county executive are very concerned and interested in us making that transformation. That's going to take a great deal of work, but it's an important part of what we do, and I think it's going to also help us with the work that we do every day. And the last, certainly not least in terms of the future, is that we are going to, and we've been charged by the CAO, to really develop a long-term customer service and what we're calling access plan. If you go back to the presentation of OLO, she talked more about what the original charges of 311 are. And the word that we've been talking a lot around is a word that we're using called resident-centric. We're going to build a resident-centric system, and that's not just the technology, but how we actually service people. So having a better understanding of the voice of the resident is going to be key to us going forward. That's why we're doing the focus groups. That's why we're doing more survey work. And I think OLO's suggestion on how we hear from people who didn't provide a service request is key to us kind of building this system for the future. So that is something that we're working on now and have been asked to do by the CAO. Let's skip to this last one real quick. But as you look at those things, and some of them I've already talked about, but these are some of the future state technological things that we've been looking at. I already talked about making the website more customer friendly, but we're also going to be looking at service diversifying our service channel, more self-service options for customers, providing answers, and this is one that we also have heard a lot about, the next bus. We get a lot of calls about the ride-on bus and schedule, so we're going to try to be ready for that. Integration with CRM to capture data for management reporting. One of the things that we definitely have a need for is workforce development, so we can optimize the staff that we have, and obviously adapting to the trends of mobile technology. So those are some of the things that we'll be looking at, some of the things that we've done over the last 3 or 4 months, and I thank you for the opportunity to give you that update.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hudson. Really appreciate that update. I do want to do a time check because we have a big item and we have people that have traveled all the way over here, and it's going to take a little while. So I don't know that we're going to be able to get to Dr. Torregas all of the things that you put in the packet because it's a big issue. And if my colleagues are okay, what I'd like to do is just for us to ask some questions at this point, and then I want us to come back with your item, but integrating what we've heard that the administration is doing, maybe some of the things that we're going to discuss, as well as what the OLO report has put forth. And Dr. Torregas, if you can kind of integrate all of that so that the committee can, see the full picture with all of these 3 components and how we're going to then address issues around budget. But I do believe that it would be a mistake to try to rush everything through like this. But I do want to, thank you. I think you've touched on a lot of really important points. I'm going to turn to my colleagues, but obviously, super quickly as we come back, really looking at the whole issue of complex calls. How are you going to strengthen the notion of web-based? I am very sensitive to that because most people obviously walk around with this all the time, et cetera. But we also know that we have an aging population that still relies on making phone calls. But we need to be able to do both. And so, I'm glad that you're looking into those types of issues. Also, I still keep looking at the Spanish, the calls in Spanish. That hasn't changed, that percentage. And given the population that we have in the county, obviously there's a disconnect there that we need to address, because it's clear that this population is not accessing this tool. And we have said and been on record saying that we need to change that a bit. So those are some of the things. The liaison to the council, that's great. I think every office has kind of developed our own system to provide that feedback and help, but I think that would be a major improvement. And then lastly, this is something that I've said before, 311 also offers us a lot of data that can give us a mapping of where are the needs and what are, and as you pointed out, some of the calls, but it also can help us during our budget, because we're able to then understand what are those things that are persistent that we're not necessarily investing enough in, because year after year they keep coming up. So to the extent that we can start connecting that back into our budget, and outcomes-based budgeting and all of that as part of that, this is really important, rich data that we should be incorporating by geographic area. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Councilmember Friedson.
Thank you very much, Council President. I appreciate that. Some of my questions do relate to some of the technology areas, so I'm just going to raise the questions, not necessarily with the expectation that they're going to be formally discussed today, but just want to make sure that
When we come back, we can have.
yeah, just to make sure that they're out there and that, frankly, I don't forget them. So appreciate that. I share all of the comments that the Council President made. I do appreciate coming in to meet with me and my team earlier this week. We had a really robust discussion. This added even more detail to those conversations. I appreciate the background, Mr. Hudson, that you have on doing some call centers. I think that adds a new perspective. Welcome to this role. It's a pretty significant undertaking, and I do believe in terms of the gatekeeper versus gateway question. I think the answer is gateway 99% of the time, and 1% is gatekeeper. The data is important, but really this should be a tool and a portal to make sure that our residents can get the services that they need, and make sure that they understand how to access the services that they need. Everything else to me is secondary. It's not that it's not important, but it is secondary to that. I think this report, Ms. Hall, is terrific. Thank you and OLO for all the work that you've put in, and Dr. Tragus as well for all of your thoughtfulness. I just want to thank everybody for that. I want to particularly thank my colleagues as well, who've been working on this issue for quite some time, and have really tried to shine a light on what has been an ongoing challenge for residents. And I think the Council President said it well, as 3 district council members who deal with constituent issues on I would say a daily basis, I would say a minute-by-minute basis, because daily basis almost seems like we get 1 or 2 a day, and I feel like we get 1 or 2 a minute. And so I don't want to eliminate that part. I think that's a critical part of our job, but I want to make sure that we are working together and providing the type of service that we expect, and that residents, more importantly, expect, and that we're doing it in a way that is up to the standards that Montgomery County has always had and should continue to have. In light of that, I am happy that you used the Nats example, because it led me to think about how I would compare the Nats example. And I'm thinking that we've been in the 19 to 31 May 24th Nationals, and I want us to get closer to the World Series caliber Nationals. And I think your comparison to having 8 players on the field was a good example. Nationals had some injuries and some roster issues and needed to get healthy. You should have a roster that can sustain people having sick days and people having kids who need them to be at home, and folks who need to take care of parents and just take a vacation and live their lives. And just to a point, we asked residents for what they thought about 3-1 leading into this conversation. And while they came up with a tremendous number of really good suggestions and really good feedback, constructive and otherwise, the one thing that was consistent was that the actual customer service representatives who they dealt with were professional, were courteous, were helpful. So the problems that we have, and I want to be very clear, are not based on the people we have working there. They're based on whether or not we, as a county government, are putting those people in a position to succeed. And so I just want to be very clear about that, and any criticisms and concerns and issues that have been raised in our prior conversations and as part of this exercise have never been about the folks who are doing the hard work every day. It's been about the fact that, I believe that, and we've discussed, that we haven't necessarily put those folks in a position where they could do their jobs in the way that they would want and the way that we would want, and that's not fair to them. And this is about really, trying to make sure that we improve upon that and build upon that. But specifically, the Nats got better because they went and got bullpen help, right? I mean, they desperately needed bullpen help. There was a need on the roster. It was woefully inadequate. My view here is that the bullpen help is technology, and it's temporary help at the times when we know we need support. I mean, as you mentioned, there's 3 periods of time, October, August, and May. We had talked about it before, where there's a surge in requests. And so supplementing the folks who are there with appropriate support to make their jobs easier, to make their jobs better, to ensure that they have adequate time to have lunch and to have their breaks and to make sure they get the proper training, I think is critical. And I think that it's not just about making sure that we have more personnel, although that is certainly part of it, and the Council President and Vice President deserve credit for the push that they have done in recent years to make sure that that happened. But it's also about supplementing with other opportunities to help them do their job and to complement them in the jobs that they're doing. I think, and I share the views of the Council President. It's not an or question, it's not a replacement question, it's an and question, because we do have many residents that aren't going to use an app, that aren't going to participate in a live chat, that aren't going to go to the web, but we have tremendous number who are, and I think that we are set up to do that, and I don't think currently we have the type of interaction that residents expect from the services that they get everywhere else besides government. And so I think we need to step up our game and have the chats, have the app, have more than just making the website better, it's making the actual technological platforms better to be able to provide those services in real time and help folks. I mean, my goal would be to have some personnel, not just the artificial intelligence that was mentioned, but some personnel that are on chat, which, I think you'd be much less frustrated if you waited 1 minute and 31 seconds, as I think was on the other slide, for a live chat to respond, to finally get to you in the queue, than you are sitting on hold with music playing that you might not like, or whatever the case may be. I think the abandonment would be improved. And so I'm hopeful that we can have that conversation, not just technology in terms of artificial intelligence and other aspects, but how we can, have live chat like are available in many other in many other areas. Just to give an example, in my previous professional lives in the comptroller's office, at the Maryland 529 College Savings Program, we had tax season and we had college benefit season. And in both of those cases, we deployed additional support and additional personnel to help, because we knew that the regular staffing complement that we had during those parts of the year just weren't adequate, but we didn't necessarily need additional support all year round. We need them for a 2-week or 3-week period of time when there was a huge surge, and it would be totally unfair to expect the staffing that we had during the regular part of the year to be able to do that. And so both by moving folks who are in other agencies or other departments into that, to answer calls during that period of time was one way, and the other way was temporary workers to be able to bring that in. And we've had a conversation about, I think, county retirees or other folks who might not want to work full-time at the county but have a connection to the county might want to work here. I think there's tremendous opportunity in our community. We don't lack for talent or interest in serving the public in Montgomery County, and so figuring out ways to deploy that interest in the community to be able to serve the community good and community need, I think would be really helpful. I did want to mention, we had several residents reached out and talked about one of the concerns that they have is they frequently use 311. They talked very positively about the customer service representatives who they always interact with. But their concern was that they don't get a follow-up. And so there is no closing of the loop. And so what they end up doing is actually calling our office to say, hey, I called 311. Here's what happened. Can you check to see what happened? Or they call back 311. And so it's clogging the 311 line with somebody whose service request might be completed. with an additional call that's unnecessary. They're frustrated because they could have heard something. So could you speak to that? You know, and I'll just give an example. One was a pothole, you know, of whether a pothole got fixed. And the issue is, or sidewalk, the issue is it wasn't just whether or not the sidewalk or the pothole got fixed. It was also if the pothole didn't get fixed, there was a reason it didn't get fixed. Maybe the road was being resurfaced in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks and it was in queue, so spending money to fix the pothole didn't make sense. Or it was a state highway and they didn't know it was a state highway. Either way, they weren't told that necessarily immediately by the department or by 311, and so it caused them to then have to follow up and additional frustrations to happen. Can you just talk about how we address that, or if there's plans to address it?
And I know we're going to come back to this. And first of all, I appreciate both of the suggestions and comments that you made. We're looking at a lot of these, and I do want to say real quick, because you all both mentioned it, there are a great group of people who every day are answering the calls and talking to residents of Montgomery County and servicing them to the best of their ability. And we're here on their behalf. So I did want to kind of give them a shout out while we're here. But real quick, the answer to your question is that is one of the areas we're looking at very seriously. And I'll steal a little bit of words that Costas uses often. End-to-end service. It's the whole notion of the whole customer experience from the time you call to the resolution. And one of the things that we are looking at very heavily is that communication process from the time a request is put in to the day it's actually finished. We don't do the best job of what you just described in terms of status updates. That's one of the reasons why the email acknowledgement piece, which was brought up in the OLO report, and one of the reasons why we're looking at instituting it again, giving people the ability to know what's going on. I describe that as kind of the where's my Domino pizza along the line of processing, or my Amazon Prime order, where is it in the process?
I appreciate that. When we follow up and have the next conversation, I hope that could be,
Yes,
you know, what the specific plans
Yes,
are of how we
absolutely.
solve that
We will have
issue, because
that.
I think it's
We will have
a
that.
big issue. And then another question for the next conversation is just the data from 27 and 2018. If you could share with us when you come back on specifically, you know, what improvements have been made to make sure that we have consistent data and that we are ensuring that we are following up with it, to the council president's point of making sure that we're using this data then for the budget. We got to make sure that we're collecting the data and that any issues with the data are dealt with. And so if you could just be ready when you come back to provide that to the committee, I'd be very appreciative, and thank you very
Appreciate that.
much.
Yeah, and we definitely want to, what we'll do is that if there are particular questions, we will forward it to you, Dr. Duragas, and then when we get back into very, specific conversation, this is a little bit more high level, like where are we going? Because I know we all have some real specific things, then we can address those. Council Vice President Katz.
Yeah, and I will be brief. First off, it was a great OLO report. I know this was the first time, I think, probably that you came before the GO committee, and you did a wonderful job, so be very proud of yourself. And I, too, enjoyed and appreciated the baseball analogy. I didn't enjoy it as much as Andrew did, but I enjoyed the baseball analogy. But
enough to have your own?
yeah, that's right, yeah. But I do think it's very important to note that you can't answer the phone if no one is there to answer it, and that's our job. Our job is to give people who need information the information they need in a timely and in a correct manner. I do think that, and it's been mentioned, but whenever you go to a car dealership, the next day they send you more than you want to, you get an email that says, how did we do? And we should be doing the same thing. We should be sending an email back to our customers and say, we fixed your pothole and hopefully you're satisfied the way we fixed it. Because every now and then you get somebody that says, they said I fixed it, but they didn't. And so, and I think it was the fair statement in the very beginning of this that says it's not just you who has to do these things. You take the information, you being 311, and then you have to call a department to figure out this thing. So when you come back, I do think we should figure out what's the best way to get information internally as well as to our customers, the people that called in. I think we also need to figure out why, if we can have a better system than to have the county employees call 311 for a health issue or for some other issue, and why they can't just take care of that themselves. These are county employees, not external. I mean, in many cases, you might be calling them anyhow to figure out what, how to do some of these answers. And I would like to know, for years, we've said that, for instance, when someone called about a stump removal, then we would say, oh, yeah, we'll get to it, it'll take 4 years, or whatever that was, some ridiculous number. Well, first of all, I thought that we should say we don't remove stumps, and that's what we're saying, because all that's doing is causing a lot of anger. But I would like to know if there are other issues like that. If we are saying to someone when they call in, I need something done, you say, oh, we'll get to it in the next year or so, I think we need to know that as well. And I look forward to the next discussions. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, so we will definitely, work with you and you to send some of those very specific questions, but then also come back to Dr. Torreya's packet and see how we obviously continue to improve this. I really do believe that this, as I've said often, this is a great opportunity to kind of, take it to that, next level and explore some other ways that we can, utilize this very important service. And do appreciate all the work that you've done in a very short period of time, as been here, to already begin to think through some of these improvements. Thank you so much, Ms. Hall, again, from OLO, and we will now turn over to our next item.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, so now we're on to item number 3. And this is a discussion. I expect this to be, this is going to be one of probably a couple of work sessions regarding the Public Election Fund, where we will hear about some of the responses and the feedback from a survey that was conducted and some of the preliminary themes and possible recommendations. And then my hope is that we will come back to have a much more targeted conversation regarding possible amendments to the program. And so this is really just to hear about what were some of those areas that regarding the feedback that we received, and then we'll engage in some conversation regarding all of this. I also want to welcome Mr. De Marinis, which we all know very well, and Mr. Crow, and also I want to acknowledge Mr. Davis School from the committee that recommends funding, because the reality is that, you three, I would say, have played such a pivotal role in this really groundbreaking public campaign finance program. This was in many ways an experiment, and it was something that former Councilmember Phil Andrews felt very strongly about. This committee in particular worked really hard to get us to the point of adopting legislation. But we believed very, very much in the concept, and we believed very much in the benefits of a program like this. And we did everything possible to look at best practices and make sure that we would design this particular program. But the reality is that, of course, as you go through it, you then learn a lot about improvements or about things that worked really, really well and things that obviously needed to be improved. And so that's why we are here. And we're so pleased that other jurisdictions are looking at how we're doing what we're doing in order to also pursue something similar. So I really do appreciate the amazing work that both of you did, because it was also, lo and behold, a very unique, election with a high volume of candidates, with a lot of questions, and with a lot of complex, issues to navigate. And you were both very, very helpful, very much available. And that was something that I know I can say from experience. I really did appreciate, and heard other candidates also express appreciation. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Ms. Myhill, that has done extraordinary work to staff us in this particular instance, and also really carry this kind of post, I don't want to say mortem, but just post assessment of where we are. And we did finally get, we're able to agree to put forth this survey, and you've been really wonderful in staffing all this logistics. So I honestly just really want to express my appreciation, because I know you have a lot on your portfolio, and this one, wasn't easy to navigate, but it's great. So I'm going to turn it over to you so you can share with us what you've put in the packet, and then we'll engage in a conversation with both Mr. Demarinis as well as Mr. Crowe.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for those very kind words. That is much appreciated. I wanted to start out the presentation of the packet with just acknowledging that there were a lot of issues that were raised in survey responses and in testimony and correspondence that related to budgetary issues and software type issues, and those aren't really addressed in here because the focus of this work session is to just, kind of get an idea of where committee members are on certain issues as it relates to legislation that is necessary. So I wanted to, I'm not ignoring those issues, but those aren't presented as discussion items in this packet. I'm going to skip over the program operation because most of you know how the program works probably way better than I do. So if you turn to page 2, I did want to highlight some information from the first election cycle that this program was used. As Ms. Navarro alluded to, it was a very high volume of number of candidates. You'll see that 68 candidates ran for either the executive or the council offices. Of the 38 candidates that filed an intent to use the program for one of those offices, 23 candidates ultimately obtained public financing. And I'll note that during the primary election, one executive candidate and 2 at-large candidates and 2 district candidates obtained the maximum allowable in public matching dollars. The county ultimately spent about a little over $5 million during the elections on the public financing, about $4 million in the primary and $1 million during the general election. I attached in the packet for your information a report by an organization called the Maryland Public Interest Research Group. They issued a report just last month that analyzed fundraising data from the elections, and they had their own conclusions, which was that small donors accounted for a significantly larger portion of the fundraising for candidates that participated in the program, which is not surprising given that it's based on small donor contributions. The average donation was smaller for qualifying candidates, again, not unexpected. They concluded that individual donors participated at a higher rate when candidates participated in the public financing program. And they also concluded that council candidates were able to use the program to run very competitive races. The council held a hearing back in March, just soliciting feedback on the program. And again, the responses were wide-ranging from some legislative changes, budget, and other issues. And I took all the testimony is attached to the packet for your perusal, but I did highlight a sampling of recommendations that appear below. I do want to highlight for you also that Common Cause submitted some testimony very recently, I think last week, that it's on Circle 48 or 49. They had a couple of budgetary issues, but they did recommend 2 changes in the law, both related to the committee to recommend funding for the public election fund. And so we can discuss that when we actually get to the issues for discussion. Council President Navarro indicated earlier that she had sent out a survey to all candidates that participated in the program, that did not participate in the program, and policy groups. Each of those entities, each of those groups got a separate survey that was tailored to information we were hoping to glean from them. And I've listed, I don't like you to have to flip back and forth, so I've listed in the packet what the questions were and what the survey responses were. And I'm happy to walk through each of those, or what I will note is that I'll just walk through each of the questions and just highlight for you what the main responses indicated. I'll note that I did attach all of the survey responses, names excluded, to the back of your attachment, or as an attachment to the packet, so that you have that information for you. The first question that was sent to participants is why you chose to participate in the program. And you'll see that the candidates, the most favored response, and they were able to select any number of these. It was not just a pick one. was that it placed a greater emphasis on small donors in the election, followed by it was a step toward good government. The second question was what problems, which is always what we're interested in, how we can, it was a good program, it was a good start, but we're always interested in how we can improve it, was what problems did your campaign experience? And a significant number of candidates agreed with the statement that it was very burdensome to prove residency for donors, because as you know, donors must be residents in order to be matched. The third question was what changes you felt would improve the process for the next election. There were really two of these responses that were sort of similar. One of which was to allow participants the ability to correct their initial qualifying report. The other one was to change the one bite at the apple rule, where if there was an error at the beginning, can they go back and fix it? But a close second was also allowing donors who gave the maximum amount in the primary to also give the maximum amount again in the general election. And some of these issues are raised in the discussion section, so feel free to stop me if I'm talking too fast or going too fast. As I mentioned, the council president did send a survey to all non-participants in the program, but the response was there was only one campaign that actually responded to the survey, and that participant indicated that they did not participate in the program because they didn't think that they could reach the initial threshold of $20,000, and they suggested that that be lowered. I will note that one of the reasons there was a threshold amount was because the idea was that someone should have the ability to run a competitive campaign before they are able to tap into the public program. The policy group survey was pretty wide open. It just asked what worked well and what didn't work well and what recommended law changes. These responses were quite interesting because the council sent these links out all over, and so a lot of residents wrote in, and they didn't really have a lot of specific law changes, but you'll see on page 7, the questions they weren't tallied, and so it wasn't as easy to piece together a clear majority of what worked well or what didn't work well, but all the responses are bulleted there for you. I will say on these particular responses, a lot of them were not changes to the law, really. They were changes to make it more user-friendly and user-oriented. And I'm happy to move on now to the section for issues for committee discussion, but I didn't know if you had some initial questions or if Mr. Crow or Mr. DeMarinis had some initial questions or statements.
Any remarks?
Or I'm happy to dive right in.
Let's get into it.
Yeah.
All right, so again, I wanted to, we'll just move on to the issues. The idea of this work session is that we've raised several issues that we think should be some legislation that will be a comprehensive legislative package. Again, this isn't related to the budget, and this isn't related to software issues, although we can certainly have that discussion too. This is not an exhaustive list. I don't want anyone to think that these are the only changes that may need to be made, but these are the ones that, to get the discussion started, we thought were most appropriate. The first being, I've already mentioned it, but reconsider the one bite of the apple rule. The code provides that a potential candidate can only submit one application for certification to participate in the program, and that the candidate can correct a mistake in the application for certification within a certain time period. It's not always clear what the code means by mistake, and this issue was discussed at length during the council's public forum and was raised several times, as I mentioned, during the survey process. And so that's the first issue that I raised for your consideration.
Okay, before we get into the conversation, Mr. Skoll, I know that you just joined us. Feel free to come and be at the table so that we can, include you in the conversation. But before we get into the conversation about these specific items, I do want to acknowledge, though, that, as you stated, we're not going to talk about, funding or software. But this is totally, linked to the conversation we're having. And so even though we're going to focus on this and then we'll separately have that other discussion, I don't want folks to think that we're going to do this in a vacuum. I am very, very aware that we are going to have to address issues of resources, and we're going to have to address, when it comes to staff, and we're going to have to address issues of also the software. Because if not, even making all of these changes would not, get us to where we're trying to be. Those two issues, in my opinion, undergird everything that we might be able to accomplish with regards to a lot of this feedback and some of those amendments. So I just want to put that out there. I don't think we can avoid the, the elephant in the room. And I think it's appropriate because obviously, as we said, this was the first time we were doing this. We've learned a lot. There's no doubt that we're going to have to figure out how much more funding, staffing, and hopefully what changes we can do to the program so that it's more intuitive and more user-friendly. I know I'm not like the most technologically advanced person in the universe, but it was a little bit challenging, and I've heard that a lot. So, just want to put that out there as we're having the conversation. But let's go ahead and go through some of these possible recommendations that have really come out of the feedback, and then we'll figure out whether today, or if we're going to have follow-up, we can then get into the specifics of, funding and software upgrades. All right. So, so we're in number 1, which is reconsidering the one bite at the apple conversation. So why don't I pause? I will also turn it over to you in case, Mr. DeMarinis, you have any, general comments, and then if you have any particular observations regarding this first recommendation.
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me, and I just wanted to say it was a very successful program, and was more successful working collaboratively with David Crow and others as well, and the candidates also were very good in this first iteration of this program here, and we did learn some lessons from it, and hopefully we can make it even better the second and third times around. As for the one bite at the apple approach here, the one thing that is always problematic with this is that what does it mean to cure mistakes? Now, and when we get into this, you have to look at it and saying, if it's already in the report that you filed, saying I classified a person as, say, out of county when they actually were in the county and thus not eligible to be matched, or I didn't calculate it correctly at that time, and that's a mistake. Meaning I'm just looking at the report and you have 10 days to correct any mistakes on that report that you've submitted. Now, or is this meaning that you submit a report, you think it's over, but clearly it is not, it is underneath the limits, and there was no mistakes on the report. It was entered in all correctly. Are you allowing the candidate then to come back and say, supplement that with additional contributions? Another, as another bite at the apple, not necessarily a mistake, but a second submission for reconsideration. And I think that's where we would have to make sure, because, when you say mistake, to me, it means, you're fixing the report that you submitted. You have to live and, stand by that report, that dollar amount that you've raised, and all the contributors that you've raised in there. Or if you had forgotten to add someone in there during that period, but you cannot go beyond the cutoff date in which you have submitted that report. Or are we talking about, I've not only forgot a whole bunch of contributions that I forgot to put in there, but now that I was well under, or I hit that button by mistake, I didn't mean to submit this at all, do I have a period to pull it back and then resubmit a brand new certification request? Let me just say, right, at one point, you're always going to have a person who is, you have to have a finality to this process here, because you don't want to have a person constantly coming in, submitting, coming in, submitting, coming in, submitting. You know, either because at one point there, the amount of effort and timing, I mean, yes, it would be nice to have more staff here, which all comes together here, especially as more programs come online. There's going to be a person that would be irate because they're going to fall or fail at this level here. But I leave that policy decision up to you. But there has to be. But when you talk about mistakes, please be very clear as to what you mean on this front.
And if there were to be a sort of like, okay, there's a 10-day, whatever we call it, grace period or whatever, where you can, correct mistakes, or if you somehow misinterpreted something and you were short 2 contributions, right?
Right.
That you can, but it's sort of like after that 10 days, then that's the finality versus oh, but I need another because then I didn't, you know what I mean? I mean,
Right.
that, I wonder, would that be something that is, that would be possible in case there's somebody that misinterpreted something? I mean, obviously I tend to be super paranoid, so of course I'm like always trying to make sure I know what's the date and have more than, in case and things
Right.
like that. But if somebody cut it so close and it turns out that they either misfiled, or I think there was a case where somebody thought in-kind contributions counted towards
Right.
the actual, if there's like, this is the deadline, and then, I don't know, maybe there could be a trigger to a 10-day kind of grace period. After that, it's automatically done. I just offer that as a, point. Councilmember Katz.
Thank you very much. On that one, first off, I do have a concern when we're saying one bite of the apple. If somebody makes a mistake, you legitimately make a mistake. You put down and you missed it by $150 or whatever. You added wrong. I mean, whatever. You didn't. So if in that case, I believe they should be allowed to amend their report. I believe that they should be given the proper amount of time. However, if somebody waited to the last minute and said, this is what it is, and they submit everything, then that to me is another issue. I mean, if somebody submitted it a week in advance and you realize that, and you all were fast enough to come back and say there's an error here, because there is some of that too, and you came back and said there's an error, I think they should be allowed to figure it out. These, especially, even for the first time, I mean, we didn't know what we were doing. We kept saying we were building the plane as we were flying it, and there's a lot of truth to that. But even if it's for the next time, I mean, you're supposed to remember 4 years, ago, and it could be different people helping you and all those sorts of things. So I do think one bite of the apple is not fair. But I do think, to your point, if somebody says, I'm filing with $7,000 and I know I need $10,000, that's not fair to you either. They know clearly that they couldn't qualify. So I think there has to be something. But I think for real errors, that somebody should be allowed to amend their report to correct it.
But if there is a cutoff 10 days after, and the strange, odd chance that somebody, again, misread or misinterpreted the law and, thought that in-kind counted, I'm just putting that out there.
Right.
And then, they get the notice that this is rejected. You don't qualify because you didn't meet the threshold. Oh my God, I thought that, in-kind, so you got 10 days. It would be very difficult for somebody who comes in at a very low level, right, way below the threshold, in 10 days to be able to raise that money, right? But if they genuinely felt like, whoa, I totally missed this, can I just have, I don't know, and I'm just throwing out 10 days, I don't know, it could be a week. Can I have, 7 days to then go ahead and correct this because I was interpreting it differently. So I'm just wondering, and that would be it. Like, it's not like, then you have another chance to go off and do whatever. Because if somebody has totally tried to, be slick, it's going to be very difficult for you to be able to raise that extra amount of money in, a week or 10 days. Let's just call it, this is not easy.
No, it's not.
Right.
It's not easy to do this. So I'm just throwing it out there. I mean, I'm fine with however we define it, just for conversation. Could that be another option?
Well, but I do believe that whatever the time frame, whether it's a week or whatever, I mean, if people misread it, I mean, it could be that they did misread it and thought it said, whatever, that it said 7 and it really was 10. I mean, whatever. People, especially during those times, your mind is going 1,000 miles an hour. But I do believe that it should be whatever time frame it is, it should be from the time frame that the state or whoever comes back and says that there's a problem with this. It shouldn't be a set date, because if the state says, look, you submitted it early, and the state came back after the time frame that you were supposed to submit it, you didn't even know that you'd made a mistake. So it should be from the time that you're received notice that you do it, and it should be a set time. You shouldn't say you have a month, but you have whatever.
Well, I guess at the one time, whatever you do, I mean, this is a policy decision
Right.
for you on that front there. We'll help administer whatever which way you go. But I just want to make sure just make as clear as possible what you mean by a mistake. Or if you mean to allow the additional contributions to be added onto that report. Because I think, I know when we were going through this at one point here, what does it mean? Because I think the current code was talking about you can amend that report. And the way it was written, and I wish counsel was here, but they were not, who was a good partner in this process as well, was saying, well, because it said that report, you can only fix that report. You couldn't add any more contributions to it. So if you're going to allow, say, a grace period here of after notification of a rejection to cure any deficiencies or to supplement, that we have to make sure that the language of the code is also corrected to allow any sort of cure or remedial actions necessary.
Conversely, though, I know that in that one particular case, which is, I think, is part of what Rose, brought this forward, there was expression that the law wasn't clear enough that in-kind wouldn't, they just thought it was just contributions.
Right.
So could we then amend or clarify, that in-kind contributions perhaps don't count, if that's what we want to do? Right, that's issue number 4. But my point is that I think what gave rise to this particular instance was the fact that folks said, this wasn't clear. So either we give the grace period to amend whatever, or we make sure that we clarify in the law what exactly it is that constitutes contributions to meet the threshold, so that everybody understands it clearly, and then it's just a deadline, and it is a deadline, and you're only gonna have a grace period if you made mistakes in terms of that particular report.
So I just want
Well, I was going to say, we passed an amendment last year to allow the 10-day cure period?
Right,
So, I guess, is this related to what constitutes a mistake, whether you can add additional contributions,
right.
and what changes we'd make on top of the 10-day cure period from what's in the law? Because we did do the amendment,
Right.
it was mid-cycle
Right.
to allow that cure period.
Well, and right, so I think the threshold conversation is that what is that cure period? What does it relate to? What does it point to? Is it
What's
a
upon the
mistake?
denial of, when they deny an application? So you have 10 days from the denial.
Right,
of the
from,
State Board of
which is what he was discussing, and I think the threshold question here is, so is it because you made a mistake that was, just kind of genuine mistake of input? Or was it that you counted some kind of contribution that did not qualify, and you feel like, it's not fair that here I've done, all this effort, raised all this money, and because I misinterpreted and said, ooh, in-kind doesn't count, I'm disqualified, right? I think that is what we're gonna have to figure out, as we have this conversation.
I think along the clarification parts, one of the things was that we tried to at least put as much information that we could initially out to the general public, as well as to candidates. We made a summary guide initially, trying to show them whatever questions that we thought of. And then as questions arose throughout the election year, we had the frequently asked questions category up there, which, by the way, was a good resource, and also was filling in a lot of gaps between the law and the regulations, because we had to make some policy determinations with this. Those are also things that it's not necessarily in the 4 discussion points here, but something that, as we revisit this entire law here, that, please revisit the frequently asked questions answers here because if you disagree with those policies, or if you agree with those policies, they should be codified in a method, because then it makes it clearer, rather than, oh, it's not in the law, it's not in the regs, so you have to go to this other source here, which is frequently asked questions and could change over time.
Okay, Amanda, take that up. Councilmember Glass.
Thank you, Madam President. And the reason I'm joining the committee today is because on March 3rd in 2014, I came before the council when this legislation had its public hearing, and I testified in support of it back in 2014, recognizing how important it is, and was proud to participate in this last cycle and wanted to share my thoughts. So thank you for letting me do so. On this particular point, I want to associate myself with what Ms. Navarro just said, or said a few minutes ago, about going above and beyond. And while the threshold have numeric and dollar values to it, the safest thing to do is to go above and beyond that in case there are problems. And I liken this to jurisdictions where they have ballot signatures. And if you're required to get 100 ballot signatures, you would be prudent to bring in 150 or 140. And so there's that level. But I do think, that said, I do think that we should change this this rule, because while the hard aspect is trying to figure out how someone who just missed out by one donation or two donations, having looked at the data and the reports, there were a number of candidates who clearly hit the submit button with one or two donations. And so trying to figure out what the intent was there, saying, hey, look at this new program. I want to see if I inputted this one donation correctly, submit, and what happens. And they are treated exactly the same as someone who just missed by $50 out of 20,000. And whether it was someone who, whether you only added that one donation or two, but you had more, that you just wanted to see the system, we will never know that. But I think they need to be treated the same. And so by having that one grace period where people can correct the error, whether done for whatever reasons, not wanting to mind read, but I think it is a sensible thing to do in a very complicated system.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Councilmember Friedson. Before I lose my thought, because I'm older than you are. The other piece, though, is I keep relating it back to the software, is that I assume that if I, or my treasurer inputs everything, and we have to, of course, be able to indicate that this is an individual donation, or this is a business, or whatever it is that we're doing. I assume that if somebody then says this is in kind, right, and if the software is able to then calculate, it could throw off the fact that, wait, these are in kind, warning, kind of a thing, so that the person, is able then to realize, okay, this, I can't, this is not part of the law, but it's, I think that we can build into the software also, particular, demands and just signs or whatever messages that kind of guide you through it, and then tell you, this is the grace period. Because I feel like part of it too was there was a lot on the candidate or the treasurer to figure out as we were inputting into the program, that perhaps if we do some type of upgrade to the software, it can give us much more feedback that could be a lot more useful as you're going through it. So anyway, it was just something relating back to this issue of software.
Thank you for that, and I appreciate all the comments that have been made. I think I share a lot of the views of my colleagues, and frankly yield to them with their experience with the process and what could be improved upon it. I've really tried to listen to some of the campaigns and the ones that did it, the ones that didn't do it, why they didn't do it, why they did it, how they liked it if they did do it, and particularly not just those who were successful in it, but those who weren't. I appreciate the fact that we have, I think this body has gone out of its way, and we'll continue to try to get all of those perspectives as we figure out how to improve the program. I just wanted to understand specifically what we're talking about when it comes to the one bite at the apple rule, so to speak, because some of it is a deadline question. You know, so the question is, if you submit with 7,000 and you need 10,000, and you submit it and you put down the marker and you're effectively going through a loophole to get an extension of the deadline. I see that as problematic. I think that that is probably unfair to the interest of the process for everybody else who is participating in it, and so I'd want to avoid that. But what my understanding was, at least, and I plead ignorance here, but my understanding was that the concern was not that there was a deadline that was set up in order to qualify, and there were folks who were rushing to get it in on that date, and they made a few mistakes and needed to have a grace period. But it was, you only get one chance to qualify, and so whatever you submit at whatever time you submit it, not necessarily related to the clock ticking down, but related to when you thought you were ready. Am I missing? So, because I think those are two different things. I mean, I would be really uncomfortable with the idea of having a deadline, allowing somebody to submit on the deadline, and not having very specific parameters of what a mistake is. I think we need to be very tight on that and very specific for the fairness of all those involved and for the expectations of the public, so that there isn't any impropriety. On the other hand, if it's just whenever you submit it within the eligible period that you can submit, that if you make an honest mistake, no matter what, if it's an omission or if it's an address or whatever, or if you counted wrong or whatever the case may be, being flexible there, I'd be much more comfortable with allowing somebody some level of grace period to be comfortable. But I see those as two very different things, and so could you just clarify for me, you know, are we talking about both? Are we talking about one or the other?
It's more when the campaigns decided to start hitting their certifications. They are the ones that asked for the certifications. They're the ones that made the calculations and hit the submit button for the request. So there is a screen that goes like, do you want to submit now for certification? You know, yes or no. It is, you know, they're the ones that then affirmatively said yes at this particular time. And the way the code was written, it was just that once you make that one request, this is the only time that I'm supposed to look at you. And if if you fail, you're out of the
one
program.
review, and when
Right.
you decide when the review is.
Right, exactly. I mean, like, because they might say, like, I know I need the money now. I need that to buy that for that ad buy or something to that effect. And if I don't get it soon, I'm going to be out of this. I can't wait the extra 2 weeks. I mean, there's all of that, and that's the political calculus that is beyond me. But at this point, yes, these are things that are within the window. I mean, we had one candidate wanting to always be the first and trying to rush into it, and and I think they actually did.
Right, there's a political dynamic.
Right, exactly, right. They did it
close
before
quickly,
the
qualify.
window of the 10-day cure period because they wanted to do it. And one of the things was before that, I was like, when the law was being passed, I was like, please do not file on July 4th because the council is reviewing this law, and if you do so, I'm going to judge you under the standard in which you have one bite and you have no opportunity to cure. The campaign did it anyway because they wanted that. They made the political calculations that that's what they wanted to do. So therefore, we judged them and they were successful at that. But these are, I guess, at one point here, there's a little bit different here because if you want to say there's a deadline and you have one shot, grace period, fine. But if you're going to just have it as a rolling thing, what we're going to have is people that are going to constantly go in there. Oh, check my 7,000, check my 3,000, check this to see what my number is, and it's just going to be there. Whereas they should just be filing their reports, and at one point when they're ready, that's when the committee will or the staff will look at it and go, okay, now let's take a look at it because we have to go through it and take a look at to see, if the names are the same, if there's addresses, if they try to put in a Washington D.C. address but then claim it to be a Montgomery, county resident and things that then we go back and forth. I've asked questions probably about everyone's, contributions, at least sent something to them, and saying, is this the same person? Is this not the same person? Please verify. I can't distinguish it on this front here.
I think, Ms. Milo, did you have something to weigh in? I saw you raise your hand.
I was trying. I learned from my kids. Raise your hand. Something that may help, Mr. Friedson, is that the way that the law is specified now for this cure period for a mistake for the initial application is that it has to be submitted within 10 days after rejection from the board or the end of the qualifying period, whichever is earlier. So if somebody is submitting something the day that the qualifying period ends, they can't use that 10 days because
Done.
it's done.
Okay, so that was my sense. I thank you for clarifying that. And so the concern that was raised, which I share, I think would be already satisfied within the way that that part is written, right? Where you can't, your grace period can't extend into beyond, if when you submitted it, you didn't qualify, then you didn't qualify. The question is, if the grace period would still fall within it, would you not have a chance to fix an honest mistake that was made? And I think.
Can't be saved by the bell.
Right, right. You can't extend the clock. Yeah, okay. I just wanted to clarify that. I appreciate the clarification. I'm much more comfortable with trying to be flexible on curing a mistake within the period than allowing somebody to add new contributions or add, new aspect, because that would be pretty problematic, I think, for staff administration and also just for the integrity of the election for the
All right,
public.
so I think that we have consensus on,
We're all the way up to
On
number
that.
1 on this. We're now at 2.
we're doing real well.
Yeah, second rank for us in bonds.
Hopefully issue 2 will be a little simpler. And it's funny sometimes when I write the packets and, I write them out, I'm like, well, I know obviously the answer, but when you get into the issue, we're like, oh, this can be complicated. So issue number 2 is, and this is one of those, when is the reimbursement cutoff deadline? The county code specifies that a certified candidate can continue collecting contributions and receive a matching contribution up to a primary general election. In practice, this language was ambiguous because county regulations allow candidates only to submit for matching funds on the first and third Tuesdays of the month. And so this language could be clarified by expanding this deadline to 30 days after an election and make clear that contributions that are submitted up to and including election day are matchable.
Good with that.
Okay. Councilor Richardson.
I would just say, should it be for expenses incurred during the election period? Because I get that the bill could come after and should be paid. I think it's appropriate for it to pay after, but it should be for an expense that's incurred during the election period.
However, the matching funds are based on contributions, not on the expenses. So it doesn't matter.
Oh, it's just on when the contribution, okay, got
We're
it.
going to get to the closing out of the account.
Got it, sorry, never mind. Good point.
All of these are very intertwined.
Yeah, exactly, right.
The third issue is one that the council heard from, is whether or not a person should be able to contribute the maximum during both the primary and the general. County codes sections 16-23 and 16-24 make clear that an individual can only submit a $150 contribution for the entirety of the 4 years. Several campaigns responded to the survey indicating their belief that donors should be able to give $150 for the primary and another $150 for the general. There's no legal issues, that's a policy consideration.
Councilor Katz.
This is one that's, to me, is very interesting, because especially in Montgomery County, we have a lot of self-financing candidates. And the reality is that if you are in the primary and you've spent, and I got the maximum, and I didn't have an opponent in the general, so what I'm saying isn't about me, but if you spent everything you have in the primary, and you have a person who is going to be a self-financing candidate or a write-in candidate or whatever, they've already collected a lot of money, and you've already spent all your money. And you can't go back the way it's written now. You can't even go back to your original 150, your most, the people that are supporting you the most or the fastest or however that's said. Part of what I think, and I don't know how this would work, but part with what I've thought about is whether or not anybody that qualifies in the primary and for the general itself, they should get some money as a seed money immediately for the general. if you've already qualified from the donations that you've already gotten. And maybe there should be, you know, some additional that's allowed from the previous donors or additional donors or whatever. But I just think that it's really a troubling thing if somebody has already collected a lot of money and here you're starting out fresh again, and you actually have to go out and, even though you don't have to get every $150 starts, you know, you get a match for that, for the general, the way it's written, it's still a problem because you have to go out and get another 20,000, you know, 10,000 people to help you out. So anyhow, I just think we need to look at that.
Councilmember Glass, very good point.
I hear you, and I'm going to disagree with you.
Okay.
And the reason why I disagree with you is because the person who's sitting across the street is County Executive Mark Elrich, who faced 5 or 6 challengers in the Democratic primary, reached the maximum contribution, and then faced 2 other challengers in the general election and reached the maximum contributions again. And if you ask him, he'll say it wasn't easy, but he won. And he won by cultivating new donors. And ultimately, that's what this program is all about. It's about getting as much of the electorate invested in our politics. And as someone who ran against 32 other people in the at-large race and was one of 2 people to max out in the primary, I then did a little fundraising in the general because we, unlike you, we had 4 Republicans who ran against us, and some people wanted to make contributions, and we all won with 60-some-odd% of the vote. What I'm concerned about is a perpetual campaign and a waste of taxpayer dollars, quite frankly. You know, the $250,000 that was raised that I raised in the primary, if we allow funding again to reset for the general, I would be allowed to raise another $250,000, and for what, I ask? To run a campaign which history has shown one party traditionally wins. And I just want to be mindful of the political reality here and be mindful of the taxpayer dollars and be mindful of wasting more resources. And I'll just end by saying what I think the program, again, is intended to do is get as many real people involved. And County Executive Elrich is a testament to what this program is and the success of it.
I guess I'll respond and say something real quick. I mean, I think that the candidate would have to take responsibility for what you just described, right? I mean, if I know that, you know, I have a pretty good chance, et cetera, and then I go out and try to raise all this money for no reason, you would have to respond to that. But I don't know that I would base this on just this one particular election, which was so unique, because I'm also thinking about like younger people, people of color who are trying to get into this. You know, I'll be frank. I mean, there are a lot of people who have very nicely developed networks, which it may not be that difficult. But there are also a lot of people who are thinking, maybe I will run for office, and this is a great thing, and those networks are not as developed, and they want to go ahead and develop them. But to me, having this almost disadvantage, it's kind of tough, especially for, as I said, for people of color who are underrepresented in these spaces. And so I do see this as a piece where, you know, we should try to find a way to make that available. You know, if it's not a contested race or, you know, I think that we as candidates would have to also defend, you know, our spending and how we strategize that. But I also don't want to, you know, tie somebody's hand and inadvertently make this decision based on a particular case where, you know, the county executive won by a little bit, but this is somebody who had very, very amazing name recognition, has been around for a very long time. Not sure that, you know, a lot of those folks who don't have those access to those networks would have been able to pull it off. So anyway, I'm not sure I see it that way.
Can I say one of the, first off, I hear what you're saying, and as I say, I've wrestled with this myself. But the idea is that these should be small donors. And if we're saying you can be a small donor the first time and we want you to be a small donor the next time, that's not as being as small a donor. And so if that's the idea, if you want to do this for small donors, to me, a way to do that would be to give some money. And on the way that Mark's race was, if he were only running against a Republican candidate, I think there would have been a whole lot of difference money being raised for that issue rather than for the fact that he was in a very different type of race than we've ever had before. I mean, so I don't know that, to Nancy's point, I don't know that we can judge this election by how this would work in the future. But, and I don't know the right answer for this, but I am concerned that if someone is living through this system, in which they should, it's the right system to live under, how we can help out that person so that they don't feel that they're under that they're under a different threshold, a different advantage from somebody else. And so I don't know the answer, but I know there's a problem.
I just want to make a point about this here. So a couple of things that that you would need to address if you do I would say almost like a per election
Doesn't the
process.
federal government do it that way?
Well, the difference is, let me just say this, the federal government, everything is by election. So there's a primary election contribution limit and a general election contribution limit. Maryland is unique in a sense that we do not have it by elections. We go by election cycle. We do the 4 years. So both the primary and the general are in it. So everything is, that's why it's a per election cycle. So it doesn't matter, it covers both. So in a sense, you would be kind of changing the contribution structure from the state level and putting like a square peg in a round hole here. The other thing too is that the program is unique and was designed post Citizens United because the cap was on the public contribution side, not on the amount of contributions one can raise. And one of the things that I think we went back to was the idea of holding qualified contributions in a pending status so that once a candidate had reached the maximum threshold in the primary election, they would not be penalized for getting those contributions. So that then they would come into the general election and I would just say, now they're in a general election, they're contested, please release another $30,000 to this candidate immediately. Additionally, you have unopposed candidates that were meeting the threshold, waiting for that money then to be used for the general election. If you do a per election cycle here, would then the $150 be matched in the primary, even if it was pending, and then be matched again in the general? So then all of a sudden that individual is now giving $300 matched at that high rate. And the same goes for the unopposed candidate. If all of a sudden they met all the thresholds there, then they raise the same amount of money again from the same contributors. So now all of a sudden you're going from a matchable rate of from $150, matched up to $600 to $300 with a check for $1,200 there. So these are some of the considerations that you would have to consider. And then all of a sudden, if you're not going to match it twice, then I think that you're going to have political problems and everything else. Yes, and I remember some of the discussions was that the idea is to actually reach out then across to your opponent's base and trying to unite your party behind you and expand your donor base, as one of the reasons was why it was per cycle as well. But those are some policy considerations for you if you decide this route here on how you would then actually start thinking about the matching program if you do a per election basis. It's not just necessarily going, this is a person here. The other thing too is other counties, let me just say this, have looked at your model. It has spread. It has been adopted in Howard and Prince George's, and even the Baltimore City is looking at it, and I think Baltimore County. But they've also looked at it and didn't think that the $150 threshold was. I think they felt that was too low. and then maybe a $250 threshold with the last so much money not being matched whatsoever, but to keeping it under that level there for those people with.
Better to have a cushion.
Right, that, can expand their donor base or something to that effect. But these are just some policy considerations there, because I know that, for example, the county executive, right, he went beyond he maxed out, and then as soon as the election was certified, he had already 30, I think, I forgot how many, but he Dale, I forgot there, but they were waiting for that check as soon as the certification came, because I had it ready for them going, yes, here you go, the certification for the election occurred, now you got an extra $30,000. If they were then raising back to the same donors then, that would be problematic because of the double, it would be almost like a double dip on that contribution. So just for policy purposes, I just
Yeah,
throw that out.
no, this is very interesting, and I think, I mean, I would be very interested in some kind of model, maybe, this issue of maybe it's 250 and then, right, the last 100 doesn't get matched, or, I mean, I'm interested in some kind of a middle ground, just so that, because if not, what I don't want to do, and I know this is like so hard, it's people may not want to participate in the program, because if they're like, whoa, this is putting me at a disadvantage, right, then it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I do think of folks who are kind of looking at this and thinking, do I do this? Do I run? I don't have a well-established network necessarily. I'm going to do my best. So how do we build a little bit of a cushion? Anyway, some kind of middle ground would be great.
On that front there too, I think the Baltimore City program did have some sort of like kicker or something to that effect, and I think Common Cause can probably speak to that a little bit more, because each one has been kind of a little bit a different type of model, like kind of like a little bit of a grant up front on those things there, but I don't necessarily know, but type of deals there, but it's not necessarily. If you go down this road, you make sure that you flush out all the potential issues as well there.
So I'll go to Councilmember Glass, but then I think what we'll do, because we're not going to be able to get through all of these, we'll see, how far we get. But then, like in this particular one, Ms. Myhill, if you could then work with folks and with Common Cause, et cetera, and look at the other jurisdictions and see if maybe there's a menu of options that we can consider and see which one we might end up supporting. Councilmember Glass.
Really good food for thought. And Mr. Demarinis, I just want to say it's good to see you, because I'm used to hearing you on the phone, right? And so
he's used to hearing you.
right. Well, my voice might have been a little more frantic when I called and concerned than I am now. But I also appreciated the thoughtfulness for carrying over. For those of us who were fortunate enough to have more donations in the primary, you carried them over, and you had referenced the executive, and that was apropos to me as well. I like the idea of trying to figure out the financing and whether it is increasing the individual contribution on the whole. I hear the complications and the double dipping in what you were talking about, if people gave in the primary and in general. And I think the reason also, if I could guess, as to why different jurisdictions are doing it differently, is because the problem we're talking about is a good problem in the sense that you've won the primary.
Yes.
And so the political realities, which I stated before, I think need to be factored into this, and the jurisdiction in which we govern, Montgomery County, is not Baltimore County, which has a different makeup, political partisan edge to it. And so regarding networks and so forth, congratulations for having this problem, because you've come through the primary. In some cases, you might not even have a general election, and in some cases, you might have I won't put an adjective. You will have 4 Republicans, right? But my I'm a good self-editor. But my overarching concern, and I'll say it again, and Mr. Katz, you had mentioned this, is the small donors. When we allow small donors to continue giving, are they in fact still small donors?
Right. At some point, when does that change?
That's correct. So.
All right, so we'll come back to that one with perhaps some options to consider.
Yes, ma'am. The next, I think we're going, difficult, easy, so issue number 4.
Yeah, I don't know.
We all know this issue quite well. Should the law be clarified regarding the treatment of in-kind contributions? The code is very clear that the director cannot match dollars for an in-kind contribution of property, goods, or services, but there was confusion as to whether in-kind contributions counted toward the initial qualifying thresholds. County law needs to just be clear on this, that it either does or does not count towards the thresholds.
Councilor McCann?
If an in-kind contribution, if a person is only going to be allowed $150 and their in-kind contribution counts towards that $150, which it does, then that is saying to that donor that you're not going to get a match from them because they didn't give it to you in dollars, they gave it to you in services or whatever. And to me, that's wrong. Now, if we said you can give an in-kind contribution and a dollar amount beyond the $150, which we should not do, that would be another story. But in this case, the $150, the most you can give, which is the right way we're doing it, then any way that you get the $150 should be allowed to get a match, as long as they're a Montgomery County resident.
Councilmember Feetson?
Yeah, I don't agree with that. I think an in-kind contribution is by its nature different than a campaign contribution. I don't think we should be matching taxpayer dollar cash with an expense that's spent on something else. I mean, I think it also would raise, to me, all kinds of questions of, a volunteer hour, what is an in-kind contribution? Because if you're an accountant and your professional trade is accounting and you provide accounting, then that could technically be considered a campaign contribution. If you are accountant and you go knock on doors, by the statute, that is not a campaign contribution. That is a volunteer hour, and I just think that we get into very murky territory there. It's very unclear to me. I think that the challenge that we faced was that we weren't clear enough. I think that the solution is to be more clear and make sure we provide clarity, get out in front of this as we are as part of this discussion, make sure people understand it, but I would be personally quite uncomfortable with the idea of trying to navigate through that murky waters or asking your staff, which I think would be ill-equipped to be in a position to make those determinations of what's an appropriate in-kind, what wouldn't be an in-kind, what somebody's actual career expertise is, because the way that the state law, as far as I know, is written, somebody who's providing a professional service that is their career is an in-kind contribution. Somebody who is providing volunteer help, as a citizen is volunteer, would not count. I just don't know how you would resolve that.
There's a rebuttal coming.
Yeah. To the gentleman from District 1, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that if somebody does a coffee, I'm not saying volunteer, and that shouldn't be. I mean, to me, that's not an in-kind contribution. If someone does a coffee for you, and they say, look, I spent $150 for that coffee. They took money and went out and bought, goodies for that event. Then and you had an in-kind contribution from that person, then to me, that person cannot give another donation. I'm not talking about volunteering, I'm talking about actually spent money. So that to me is the difference, I think, by definition.
I guess the one thing is if you do go down this road, and once again, this is on you, this is, I'm just here to help, you have to be very clear as to what documentation would be required for an in-kind contribution. In-kind contributions is a value-based type of standard here. So while if I buy T-shirts, right, and then I give them to David Crow here, and I just say, here's all your political T-shirts of $150, I can show you the receipt. That's easy to show everything else. But what if, you're on your coffee standard there? Well, I had the coffee already in my house, or I already pre-bought, some of the crackers and the cheeses there. And then all of a sudden you don't have the receipts for that. Or it's kind of or I want to give you a signed Nats jersey, and all of a sudden I value that at $150, but I don't know if that's the true market value of that. It becomes I think this is why one of the policy reasons was it's easy to say, here's a check, here's, something, we can clearly look at it, there's an audit trail behind it to verify it, to then match it. So if you do go down the route for an in-kind contribution, the same audit capabilities and trails would have to, I would say, apply for the match. But that's just, because otherwise you're going to get into a person's, and I'm not gonna get in there and saying that jersey is only worth $50 and not the $150 because, or that baseball card for that auction that you wanna do is worth X amount of dollars. That's gonna be, then it's gonna be between the campaigns and anything else. So that's all I just wanna say on the in-kind contribution. I'm fine, whatever you decide, but just make a clear standard.
Can I make one last one? My whole point on this was if someone says, look, I went to Giant, I bought these goods, and here's the invoice, here's the ticket from what I paid for, but they could not give you anything in addition to that. I mean, if they'd already spent $100 and that was their donation and that they could give you at that point $50 in your hand. If that's the way it would work, it's $100 that they gave as an in-kind and they could only give you $50 more because you can't give beyond the $150 regardless of how you get it. So to me, that is how you're getting a match. I understand the concerns, and it's all definitional what it would a match be. I'm not suggesting that if somebody is your accountant and can donate their time, I mean they can give you $150 also, once they donate their time.
Yeah, I would prefer that we keep things as they are and just clarify it, but so in that respect, I think it's a 2-to-1, but we'll see what happens with my colleagues, the rest, but I just because it is complicated, and, I worry about figuring all of that out, so I would rather keep it as a monetary check, credit card thing.
Ms. Navarro,
Councilwoman
just
Glass.
to clarify the
Yes.
clarification that, that we would amend the law to specify that in-kind contributions do not count towards the initial qualifying threshold.
Or at any time.
Right, and the issue that this issue is designed to address is the campaign that we all know about, where there was an interpretation of county law, and then she didn't qualify, and so I just wanted to make sure I was crystal clear.
Councilwoman Glass.
I just want to say I concur, and I think it gets into murky territory that we wouldn't be able to clarify.
Okay,
Moving right along, on top of page 9, issue 5 is when should a participant be required to close their publicly funded account? And the code requires a participating candidate to return unspent money that's in the candidate's publicly funded campaign account to the public election fund within 30 days of the primary, if the candidate was not a primary winner or the general election. I've heard that this deadline can be burdensome, and that also that publicly financed candidates continue to have ongoing expenses after the close of the election. And again, this is an issue that you all know way more than I do. But I've identified 3 options, which is one is to just keep it the current law, which requires candidates to close accounts within 30 days. Another option is to extend that time frame to 90 days, which would allow more time for a candidate to submit expenses, to submit reimbursement requests. And the other is to not require candidates to close the account at all and to keep a small amount of funds in the account for ongoing expenses.
all right, Councilor Katz.
Yeah, this one, and obviously I closed out the account, but then you do have ongoing expenses. I mean, you have a website, so I donate to myself, and, I will declare it next time, but there's some people that maybe couldn't do that. And especially I guess it was to Councilmember Glass when he was saying about that when someone is successful in the campaign, you still have expenses involved with it. It's not going to be a new campaign. It is a new campaign for the next cycle, but it isn't. So, I want the same website. So I do think that there should be some way that you have to return is, you know, a certain sum, and I don't know what the amount would be for de minimis, but I do believe we should be allowed to have some money in that account, especially keep the account open, so that you can pay your ongoing expenses.
One thing also that I was thinking about was, could there be, because at this point, we close out, we return everything, right? The money that you
Yeah, every
raised
dime. You
from
have to
your.
close the account.
You raise from your contributor and the matching funds. What if we were able to retain the amount that we raised from the individual, return the matching fund, which is the taxpayer-related piece, so that we can address whatever expenses are kind of recurring? It was just something that I
I was
was
thinking the
thinking
same
about.
thing.
You might not have that much left.
Well,
Guess on my glass.
but you still could. Yeah, sorry.
Oh,
Well,
you're next.
sorry. No, I was gonna say the exact same thing. I mean, one is to restore and make the taxpayers whole for whatever is left over. To me, that seems appropriate, and I think that was the spirit of why this was in place, giving back, you know, returning the additional money. I mean, I think that makes sense somewhere along those lines, and then we wouldn't have to get into what is de minimis and what is not, because it would just be what is left that isn't matching funds. So if that's able to
I would say.
occur administratively, then I think that would be an interesting.
But at one point here, I think every monies that was returned was under what was given out. So therefore, if you go by that principle here, right? If in the principle in the state, which is public money is spent last, right? Or the public, so you spend all your private dollars first, and then you go into the public money. The ending result would be anything left over would be the public
Be
dollars.
functionally zero is what you're saying.
Right. I guess. It depends on how you want to do this. Once again, this is kind of up to you. Yes. I mean, the idea of keeping your account physically open is, you know, you can keep account that is $0 active on the state campaign site. So, you know, you don't necessarily have to physically close out your committee. You can keep, like, you know, so if that's like a code change where you can say, you know, you have to return the money, but you can keep your account open so that you don't have to change your treasurer, you don't have to resubmit a new statement of organization, and that the, something like maybe if you, upon returning, you have to submit a new notice of intent that you want to participate in the next election cycle, and that you're going to participate by those rules, so that we kind of, that you know that by returning this money and going to either to zero or some sort of de minimis amount that you have in your campaign, that you are participating in for the next 4 years, and know the ramifications of that. I think that you know, that's all feasible on that front there. But as to the ongoing expenses and everything else, I leave that up to you guys on to decide.
I think,
You're saying, you know.
yeah, I would just add in, I think, differentiating here between, because I think we're talking about two different things, about successful candidates and unsuccessful candidates, because it sounded like you were talking about a potential unsuccessful candidate who might want to run again, and I think Councilmember Katz was talking about a successful candidate who does have maybe not huge ongoing expenses, but modest ongoing expenses, just to keep a campaign website, to do, certain political activities towards the benefit of their ongoing electoral success, which is totally within the realm of the legal framework, but this system isn't set up for. So I think, I don't know the answer. I kind of was thinking what the council president was thinking. It sounds like there could be a challenge administratively to that, but I think if we are looking at it, we should be thinking about successful candidates and unsuccessful candidates, and even think about having a different treatment for them, just as is appropriate would make the most sense.
Yeah, so why don't you work on some options? And also, I think it is important to remember what you were stating, that, I mean, one thing is obviously the registration at the State Board of Elections. The other also is, you close out, you win, but you still have outstanding bills and may go beyond the 30 days. And so how to do that, so there's that practicality of it. And then this notion of, right, so we might remain as an account under the State Board of Elections, but to keep an account open at a bank, you're gonna have to have, you have fees, and then if you have credit card processing, contract, as I do, then you have to use your money, because they're charging you $20 or whatever, $25 a month or whatever, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, do I just go ahead and close all that kind of stuff, but then, so anyway, I think we need to think through those layers of what it means to remain kind of like a viable candidate, even though you've been elected, you know, you still have those kind of infrastructure in your organization that you have to continue to pay for. So we can come back and consider some options, okay? All right, I want to do a time check.
I think you correctly framed it. The winners, those who succeeded and those who haven't, 30 days for various reasons, including emotional duress. Let someone decompress and pay the bills, you know, maybe beyond a 3-week time period. I mean, right? Let's be real. And I can't speak for, well, no. So, and then the winners, I think having a viable operation, whatever that means and whatever that minimal threshold, because for those of us who are in public financing, I have to keep telling people I have no money. I have no bank account. I don't have credit. I got nothing. So I dread the day when I have to reopen all of those things, knock on wood. That's right. But for all the events and everything else that we cannot participate in, which is a disadvantage to everybody else.
And that wasn't included in this list, and I was thinking we'll talk about that when we come back.
Right.
But I do want us to have a conversation about what is allowable when you are in public campaign finance, because there are events that are directly tied to, you know, being able to circulate and raise your profile and your name recognition, et cetera, that we couldn't pay for, and that does put you at a disadvantage, because somebody that is not, you know, doing this gets to do all of that. So it was just interesting to have to navigate that as well, because I just couldn't pay out of my pocket all the time. But anyway, we can include that on the next time we come back. I'd like to go until maybe, is 4:30 okay with everybody? So we can kind of wrap this up, and then we'll see what other things we need to come back to.
All right, issue number 6, when does the election end? And while that might sound like a very obvious question, there were questions during this past election cycle regarding whether funds could be used in a recount situation. County law could certainly be clarified so it's clear when an election ends and whether public funds are available for use in a recount.
We're gonna have to figure that out.
When the election is over.
Yes, when a winner is declared.
Yeah, when the winner's declared, that's fair.
You know, in my mind, what I was thinking was there is, in state law, in the recount situation, the petitioner has 3 days from when an election is certified, and then the local board has to start counting in 2 days. There is no deadline by which a recount has to be completed. It's not specified in state law, but you could have language, and I can certainly bring options back to you, related to making sure, I need to hear from you whether or not you concur that recount should be included within, you know, the election time period or not, and then I can come back with options.
I think so.
But is there any expense involved with a recount? I mean,
Legal, lots of legal.
So,
Oh, yeah.
And additionally, and I did not bring the entire recount law, but also if you're a petitioner and you're unsuccessful, you have to pay for that recount.
can I make a suggestion? Going back to the conversation about multiple donations, the idea just popped in my head of possibly, if solely in the event of a recount, being able to ask previous donors to support you in that effort. If that is a,
you're saying,
well, I don't know whether there's a match or not, but because given the time frame, I mean, and that is operating under the narrowest of windows, and we're talking about a 2-week turnaround to submit correct an error in a report, and here we're talking about mere days after an election, and the ability to actually raise money from new people in that time period when you're trying to hire a lawyer, trying to get a legal argument together. The most prudent thing might be going back to your supporters and saying, I need you one last time, but that's not a good scenario, but if you limit it to just that, it might be the easiest thing to do.
If you do go down that route, I would almost suggest maybe something that they would be able to form a separate committee that's under the purview of the public financing law, saying you're allowed to have this one special type of entity for recount so that it's you can go to these contributors, it doesn't count against necessarily the election cycle, and the $150, and they can then be in a separate pot, and therefore it would still be disclosable, it'd still be a different type of reporting type of period there. That would be something that we could set up for it. These are just, like, almost like a separate type of fund, and I don't necessarily, and I think that's kind of how they do it on the federal side. I would have to, I didn't flush this out, but just kind of coming through my mind here.
Treat it like an emergency.
Right, because if you start combining it into your other account, it's going to be difficult to see, when you start seeing the same contributor saying $150 and then again $150. You know what I mean? Then a person's going to be like, well, why is that? Then it's a special account, and so it's almost easier to say we authorize you to do this in these emergency situations to create a different type of committee, and it's outside. It's inside the construct of the public financing thing. With this one limited exception, this is the committee, and these are the defined parameters.
So, okay, so Amanda, could you also bring us back those
But
questions? I think that we're in agreement.
Right, and no
that
match, right.
we should be able to, address those particular issues. But then how we do it, the mechanics of it, if we could have some options to react to, would be great.
Right.
Thank you. Okay.
So the item number 7 that I've highlighted is whether or not there should be a more severe penalty for campaigns that intentionally undermine the program's requirements and intent. Currently, a violation of the financing law is a Class A violation. In your packet, I've listed what the penalties for those are. Most of the time, those are civil penalties, and so it's $500 for an initial offense and $750 for a repeat offense. And the question is whether or not there should be a more severe penalty for campaigns that intentionally undermine the program's intent, such as either termination for the program, if the director finds that there's a willful violation of the construct.
This came up, do we know what this was? Do we have an example of why this is here?
I don't know how much I can talk about it as a specific candidate, but there was a complaint filed about a blatant violation of the campaign law. So it wasn't proved. I mean, we referred it to the state board for,
Okay.
but I think it died there.
And what's in place right now was not sufficient to penalize?
There's no provision to kick anybody out of the program,
Oh, okay.
no matter what. So
there
that
should
is
be,
something
yeah.
that we were
That for
recommending to potentially.
I mean, I'm just looking at the whole criminal thing, and I'm just like, oh, do we want to
And
send somebody to jail for?
Whenever we enact laws, there's always a penalty. It's either Class A, B, or C. Class A is the most severe, but if there is and this wouldn't count if you mistakenly violated the program requirements, but if there is a malicious, willful intent, we would craft the language very clear on what we're getting at, and the director would have to make a finding that there was this malicious, willful violation. Then, under that kind of a language, someone could be kicked out of the
I guess, for example, like, and I think, not to talk about any specific case or not necessarily if it occurred in this, but like, say, a pass-through contribution, right? So in order to qualify, I start telling everyone give me $150, I'm going to reimburse you
Right.
this amount of money, and then all of a sudden you get, 5-6 checks for $150 and you've reimbursed them, and that should be of a penalty that once you've tried to undermine the program there, that not only, because right now we would just, I guess according to the law, we would just not count those contributions there. Yes, the pass-through contributions would be violation of state law. We would go through the state prosecutor. But it's unclear as whether or not that would kick you out of this program or not. It should, but like kind of like some of those other, like if you do those types of violations or if you're starting to like use of a minor to like all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of like 2-year-olds that are giving you, $150. Yeah, right, exactly. You know what I mean? Like it would be like, well, where's the? Did they give you express intent? Now 2-year-olds are allowed
really
to give.
good at using
Right,
phones.
exactly. Right? They're like making credit card contributions.
Apple Pay.
And I know Montgomery, so I don't know.
2-year-old never said yes, though. Mine always said no.
Exactly. So, but there might be some sort of like those types of penalties that would be like if if there's fraud in the contribution stage, or if you've made an expenditure in a fraudulent manner, like I would say, for example, if you misappropriated funds on the expenditure side and started paying for personal expenses, meaning like your mortgage or something to that effect with the campaign funds. Now, we would go after that person at the state level.
Right.
But there's nothing besides saying, I think you would have to reimburse the campaign that money. Right, so, right, at one point
Well,
here.
we wouldn't make a contribution, further contributions, but there's nothing to say you have to return the funds that you've already
Right,
received.
things to that effect, kind of like,
All right, I think there's agreement to know.
Yeah, I agree with that, but are you saying that you're kicking him out of the program for that election cycle, or are they kicked out forever if they do that?
That's up to you.
How does that work?
I mean, that's up to you whether or not, I mean, I guess, I would just think that you would get kicked out at least of that election cycle,
So
but,
what do they care at that point? I mean, that's
well, I mean, you can,
some other penalty, but.
Well, hey, after it goes public, I don't think
Yeah.
that person's gonna wanna run
Win
again.
anyhow, yeah, well, you say that.
right, but, I mean,
Any more
But
embarrassment?
anyway, I'll take that back.
Embarrassment
We have some
doesn't-
examples.
That's right,
right,
embarrassment doesn't
exactly,
stop
but
political stuff.
you can make that decision as whether or not, like, if you violate this type of, like, these certain sacrosanct principles,
7 deadly
you're
sins,
out of this program, either perpetuity or whatever, it's your, right.
Okay, so,
So is any of that written? Is there code for any of that? Any of these wrongdoings?
No.
Okay.
that would,
Because it's different than criminal, some of which made the news last week, right? So we're
Right,
setting
exactly.
we're setting a new category just for this program.
Right, exactly, yes.
right, that in addition, you would be kicked out and blah, 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 blah.
Exactly.
And for all of these, even the issues that don't require me coming back for options, even ones that we have agreement on, we would have language that we will bring to you on
Right.
all of this.
Cool, all right, that's 7.
All right, number 8, should there be a requirement for an end of election audit? Right now, there is none. Should there be?
Who would do it?
Yeah,
Well, and part of, I will say, part of this does relate to staffing and funding and the state law that was passed. So adding an audit requirement, I mean, really, the county is going to bear the burden of paying for that.
I think it should be very clear that we already know who's not going to do it.
Exactly.
We don't know who is, yeah.
put that into the law. Councilor Reason.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful when you come back to maybe look at what that cost would be. My sense would be it would be an out-of-house, audit, that we wouldn't have staffing. You all don't have the, staffing for that. I do have an interest in that. I think we are talking about the expenditure of, a fairly significant amount of taxpayer money. We do have an account. There was a balance left in that account this time. I think that it would be prudent, but it's hard to decide on what that would be when we don't know what the scope or the cost of that type of audits. I think, as we take this up, if we could do a little bit of research to find out what that type of audit would be, what would be appropriate, how much that type of audit would cost, and then, decide as we appropriate the funds for this, that we're not talking about today, but that we also include funding for that if appropriate, if that's where we go.
Now,
Well, we'll have to figure out where,
David,
in which account it goes, but, okay.
yeah, I was just thinking the scope of the audit, as a former auditor. It's just thinking, do you audit down to the resident's address? Like, how in the world could you do that? Because people move, they're all over. And I mean, like, trying to figure out the scope of what level you dig to validate each and every one of those contributions. Because we have, I mean, yeah, you do, well, are we doing a complete audit, or are you doing, sampling auditing?
Just very quick, I mean, my sense of this, at least what I was picturing in my mind, wasn't a forensic audit where you're going transaction by transaction, and it was, more of a broad audit where you're checking, processes, the way, the timing of things. You would be spot checking individual campaigns for those type of transactions, but on a limited basis to make sure that they were done. I think the difference here from, if there is an issue that is raised that you don't have the capacity to do, maybe that could be added to the scope. I'm not sure. I mean, I think that's why it would be helpful to understand what the scope of that would be and the cost. But I wasn't picturing every transaction being reviewed as a realistic approach to this.
I think you raise a good point on the two natures of the audit. Is it on the contributions and making sure they're all kosher, or is it on the expenditure side and making sure that the funds are being used wisely? And so my question to Mr. DeMarinis, given what I said about the news of last week, I'm curious from your vantage point, how are audits done at the state level?
So we do for the gubernatorial campaign, and we do both. We go contributors and for expenditures, just to make sure. We grab all the records. Now, some of the records are already submitted with it, with the reports, like you had to submit all your receipts with all the expenditures. So that'd be something that the audit can look at a little bit sooner. And but then on the other end, we ask for all the bank records, making sure all the transactions and all the contributions and everything kind of matches up there. So yes, when we do the gubernatorial audits, it's a little bit bigger. For our regular audits, we just kind of do more spot checks off the reports, making sure that they're right, checking, and the biggest one is, of course, the discrepancy in the cash balance. Like when they're reporting something and your cash balance is different, then we start going, okay, let's see your bank records, let's see what happened with it, and why there's discrepancies, and thus then starting to flush out, missing contributions and or expenditures that are not reported. So it's a little bit of both, but we try to, we spot check it and we automate it as well. But
And while we hear in the news about impropriety usually in lawmakers, right, and their finances, in this instance, and even there, what happens if you do these types of spot checks for people who aren't successful in their political run? Do you do?
yeah,
check?
we do. Yeah, well, we look at everyone. Yes, our last audit, we reviewed I think close to 3,000 committees and went through all their reports to make sure it. And when we found discrepancies, we went through it. Now 99% of them are sloppy bookkeeping. I can tell you that. But yes, there are the 1% that then we start seeing it on the records or anything or the records mysteriously disappear, and then it becomes finable to elevation to state prosecutor or even to the FBI in certain cases.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, we have passed our time, so can we do these next two really quickly?
Sure.
All right, let's do it.
We will try. I'll speak fast. Number 9 is, should the law address what happens to a campaign that fails to qualify for the program? During the inaugural election cycle, several candidates filed an intent to participate but didn't actually qualify. It's assumed that in those situations, the candidate is not prohibited from running, but the effect of not qualifying converts their campaign into a traditional campaign. In other words, not one that is constrained by the program requirements, and county law should just clarify this.
Sure, that's fair.
Clarify it.
And finally, the code establishes a committee to recommend funding for the public election fund, excuse me. And its purpose is to estimate the funds necessary to implement the public campaign finance system and recommend an annual appropriation during the budget cycle. Common Cause Maryland provided 2 recommendations related to the committee. Number 1 is to expand the responsibilities of the committee to include public education and engagement. And number 2, because of concerns with the diversity of the makeup of the committee, either increase the number of committee members, which would require legislation, or ensure the committee reflects the diversity of the county, which doesn't necessarily require legislation. Although I'm just thinking out loud here, it is an option that we can go back and look at our general law related to boards, committees, commissions, and make sure there's adequate language in there for all of our boards, committees, commissions, to make sure that that adequately reflects the diversity of the county.
Okay, I like both recommendations, and I think that we should also take a look at the comprehensive law for boards and commissions to see how we address bullet number 2. Cool.
We did do it.
Thank you, everybody. 5
Thank you.
minutes
Thanks
over,
for-
but hey, that's
for being
good.
here.
Really
Thank you
appreciate
for
it,
being
Jared.
here.
Thank you.